Mr. DeBoer, one of the things that I'm most interested in is before we launch into this discussion about the tax code, just as any business person would do, they take an assessment of the environment and what are the needs and opportunities of that company and what are the needs and opportunities of our nation. One of those things that I think has been missing in this equation as it relates to our discussion are what are those needs and opportunities as it relates to housing. Could you comment on that as it relates to the tax code and what we need to be doing?
Certainly. I think, most people, most business people that operate, certainly in urban areas, recognize that there's a tremendous and growing shortage of what we would call workforce housing. And so people that are middle American citizens, firemen, teachers, what have you, combined incomes working very, very hard, are being priced out of our nation's cities. And we need to focus on ways to incentivize affordable housing, not just low-income housing, which is obviously needed, but workforce housing as well. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. I don't have any solutions to share with you, but it is certainly a growing and troubling problem. And as we go forward, that part of our nation has to be included in whatever is done in economic growth.
So do you think just cutting the corporate tax rate gets us affordable housing?
Well, no, I don't think it really will have anything to do with affordable housing. It would put hopefully more people to work, and it would provide more money in people's paychecks, and perhaps they would have more money to buy workforce housing, but it wouldn't directly stimulate workforce.
Do you think affordable housing is a crisis in America?
I'm not sure I would call it a crisis. I think there's an awful lot of multifamily housing being constructed today, meeting a demand for it, but it's not meeting that segment of the economy. And people need to understand, land is land, and it's going to cost the same thing regardless of its use almost. And construction costs are quite high. And so when people construct assets, multifamily, retail, office buildings, what have you, they're paying roughly the same cost to construct them. And so it's hard to understand why they would then provide low-income housing or workforce housing, because it doesn't pencil out for them from an economic point of view. So there does have to be assistance there, we think, whether that's zoning assistance or local tax break assistance or something from the federal.
Or expansion of the low-income housing tax credit?
Well, or keep in mind, as tax reform goes forward and rates lower, and I certainly am not suggesting that we don't want lower rates, but the market for the low-income tax credit is made more robust and more, positive because of what rates are. As rates go down, those will become less valuable. And again, I'm not suggesting that rates don't come down. I'm simply suggesting that if you keep the low-income housing program as it is, the incentive will naturally be reduced, and perhaps a rethinking of that incentive is in order.
Well, I think you said something very important there, but I'm not sure everybody understood it. Basically what
I may not have understood it, but it was fun saying it.
I think you said it technically correct, but the translation is that basically because a lot of people who have invested in affordable housing, as we have given them incentives for investing in it through the LIHTC program, as they're sitting there waiting to see what's going to happen with a corporate tax rate or tax rates overall, they're sitting on capital, and we're actually suppressing the amount of available investment in affordable housing at the same time that we have a crisis. So to me, as we ponder this big question, particularly as it relates to this issue of dynamic scoring and whether you're going to get dynamic growth from it, I want to make sure everybody clearly understands that housing somehow has lost its way. It used to be in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you would say when you wanted to stimulate our economy, the cheer would go up for housing. But you haven't heard that cheer in a long time. And it's time for us to focus on the fact that affordable housing is a crisis, and it's certainly a crisis in my state. It's certainly a crisis in Seattle. And we need to make sure that we're putting the right incentives in place. This is just as important as the rest of the discussion we're having here. So thank you, Mr. DeBoer.
If I may just add one thing. If you look at, and it was referenced how long we are into the economic recovery, and you looked at where, forget about affordable or low-income housing, but simply home building in general it is off where it typically would be at this point in the recovery anyway. And if it was only where it should normally historically be, our GDP would be a point higher, some suggest, and I just throw that out. And again,
Thank you.
those solutions.
Thank you.
I just.
Now, I call that
observation.
growth. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.